They don't leave loudly, and they don't warn you before they disappear. The most dangerous part is that everything still looks normal right up until the moment it isn't. No arguments, no drama, just a quiet shift you didn't notice in time. And by the time you realize their energy has changed, they've already made peace with walking away. They don't lash out. They don't argue or make a scene. There's no dramatic warning. One day they're simply no longer there, and that's what makes it so unsettling. Because when you're dealing with an empath, you're not dealing with someone fragile. You're dealing with someone who has been quietly noticing everything, every mismatch, every subtle shift in your tone, every moment your actions didn't align with your words. A lot of people assume empaths are easy to take advantage of, but what they don't see is the invisible boundary. And once that line is crossed, there's no debate, no explanation, no second chance. In this message from Motive of Mind, you'll understand what flips that switch, what makes an empath completely disconnect, and why once they do, there's no going back. One of the fastest ways to lose an empath is through emotional inconsistency, and most people don't even realize they're doing it. One moment you're attentive, warm, and fully present. The next, you're distant, distracted, or cold, offering no explanation. For many, that might seem like normal human behavior, but to an empath, it's a signal. They don't just listen to what you say, they pay attention to patterns, energy shifts, and emotional rhythm. When your words and your energy don't match, it triggers something deeper. It's not just about what changed, it's about why it changed, and whether it feels safe for them to stay emotionally connected. Empaths rely on clarity. They look for alignment between what you express and what you truly feel. So when you say everything is fine but your behavior suggests otherwise, they don't ignore it, they take it in. Over time, these small inconsistencies begin to stack up. It turns into a pattern they can't unsee. They replay conversations, analyze interactions, and pick up on the subtle disconnects others would overlook. To them, this isn't overthinking, it's observation. Every mixed signal becomes another piece of evidence that something isn't right. What makes this even more powerful is that empaths rarely confront things right away. They don't rush into arguments or demand answers at the first sign of something off. Instead, they watch. Pause. They give you space. They wait to see if your behavior corrects itself or continues. And while this is happening, something important is shifting inside them. They begin to detach, not out of anger, but out of protection. For an empath, emotional unpredictability feels unsafe. It creates a sense of instability they can't comfortably stay in. If the inconsistency continues, it slowly damages trust in a way that's almost invisible from the outside. You might think everything is fine because there's no conflict, no confrontation, no obvious signs. But internally, they're already pulling back. They start investing less energy, caring a little less each time. And the most dangerous part is how quiet this process is. There are no loud warnings unless you know what to look for. Their replies get shorter, their excitement fades. Their presence feels different, but they don't explain it. From your side, it may look like they're losing interest for no reason. But from theirs, they're reacting to a pattern you've been consistently showing. Emotional inconsistency tells them that what they feel from you today might not be reliable tomorrow. And for someone who feels deeply, that kind of unpredictability becomes exhausting. They don't want to keep adjusting to unclear emotional shifts or spend their energy decoding mixed signals. Eventually, a point is reached, not because of one major incident, but because of many small ones adding up. Each inconsistency adds weight until it becomes too much. And when that happens, the empath makes a decision, not impulsively, but with clarity. They stop trying to understand, they stop trying to fix things, they stop holding on to something that feels unstable. When they make that shift, it isn't temporary, it's a full withdrawal. What looks like a sudden disappearance is actually the result of a long, silent process. Every inconsistency you showed was noticed, felt, and stored until the pattern became undeniable. By the time you realize something has changed, they've already done the emotional work of letting go. The same thing happens with boundaries, but even more quietly. When a boundary is crossed, an empath notices immediately, but they don't react the way most people expect. They don't explode or try to punish you. Instead, they pause. They reflect. They try to understand whether it was intentional, careless, or simply a misunderstanding. Because they tend to give people the benefit of the doubt, they often let the first violation slide. Sometimes they don't even bring it up. But just because they didn't react doesn't mean they didn't feel it. They felt it fully. They just chose patience over confrontation.
In their mind, they're giving you space to correct yourself. They're watching to see if you recognize what you did and adjust without being told. This is where the quiet evaluation begins. Everything that follows is measured against that first moment.
If your behavior improves, trust can stabilize. But if the same boundary is crossed again, something shifts. The second time doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like confirmation. It tells them it wasn't accidental. It starts forming a pattern, and patterns are what matter most to them. Empaths don't judge based on isolated moments, they look at repeated behavior. And as those patterns become clearer, they begin to create distance. It's subtle at first, so subtle you might not even notice. They share less, engage less. They become more guarded with their energy. If the behavior continues, the dynamic changes even more. They begin to feel a quiet sense of disrespect, not in a loud or confrontational way, but as a deep realization that their needs, boundaries, and emotional space aren't being valued. And for someone who naturally prioritizes others, that realization cuts deeper than most people understand.
Because when an empath sets a boundary, it's not casual. It usually comes after they've already tolerated more than they should have. So when that boundary is ignored, it sends a clear message. And once that message is understood, they don't keep explaining it.
They simply step away. What this really tells them, without you ever saying it out loud, is that their patience is being stretched and quietly taken for granted. And the reason this becomes so risky for the other person is because of how composed the empath appears on the outside. There's no explosion, no emotional outburst to signal that something is wrong. Instead, the shift happens slowly. They begin to pull their energy back. They stop going the extra mile, stop adjusting, stop giving at the same level they once did. Because this change is so subtle, it often goes unnoticed at first. But over time, the connection starts to feel different. The warmth that once defined it begins to fade, replaced by a kind of calm distance that wasn't there before. At this stage, the empath isn't trying to fix anything anymore. They've stepped back internally. They're watching from a distance, already preparing themselves to walk away.
Their decision isn't driven by a single emotion or moment. It's built on everything they've observed. Every time a boundary was ignored, it added to the same conclusion. This space doesn't feel safe for them to stay open. And once that realization becomes clear, their behavior shifts in a way that's very hard to undo.
They start reclaiming themselves. On the surface, it might look small. They respond less, they're less available, less emotionally open, but internally, it's a major shift. They stop putting your needs ahead of their own. And one of the biggest changes is that they stop explaining themselves. In their mind, they've already given enough chances for things to be understood without constant repetition. They've already shown where the lines were. Saying it again feels draining and unnecessary. What confuses most people is that all of this can happen without a final conversation. There's no clear warning, no moment where they say, "This is your last chance." Empaths don't work through ultimatums. They rely on what they observe and what they feel over time. By the time you sense something is off, they've already gone through stages of reflection, disappointment, and emotional distance. And when they finally cut off, it doesn't come from anger.
Calm. It comes from clarity. They simply recognize that staying means repeating the same cycle and that no longer aligns with their self-respect. So they step away fully, not as a reaction, but as a decision they've already made within themselves. Another thing that quietly pushes an empath away is a lack of authenticity. They can sense it almost instantly, even when everyone else is convinced by the surface. It's not about obvious lies, it's about the subtle disconnect between what's being shown and what's actually real. A tone that doesn't match the words, a smile that feels forced, agreement that doesn't feel genuine. These are things they pick up on naturally because they're tuned into emotional truth, not just language.
When authenticity is missing, it creates a kind of tension beneath the surface. Everything may look normal on the outside, but something feels off underneath. And for an empath, that feeling isn't something they can ignore. They don't brush it aside, they sit with it, observe it, and try to understand what's real and what isn't. Because for them, trust is built on authenticity. And once that foundation starts to crack, everything else becomes unstable. At first, they may give you room. They might assume you're holding back, protecting yourself, or adjusting to the situation. They don't rush to label someone as fake. Instead, they watch for consistency. They look for moments where something genuine shows through, where your actions and energy align over time. But if that authenticity never shows up, something begins to shift inside them. Not because they want to reject you, but because they can't fully connect with something that doesn't feel real.
They may still talk, still show up, but the depth changes, the openness fades. They stop sharing as much of themselves because it feels like they're not meeting the real version of you. Without that mutual honesty, the connection starts to feel empty. And one thing to understand is that empaths don't need clear proof in the traditional sense. They don't need a dramatic moment to confirm something is off. They can feel emotional misalignment quickly and clearly. So when authenticity is missing, that alone is enough.
Once they recognize that, the way they engage changes completely. They don't create drama, they simply detach in a calm and controlled way. They stop investing in the version of you that feels constructed. They stop trying to figure out hidden intentions. Instead, they turn inward and protect their energy, saving it for connections that feel real and grounded. From the outside, this can be confusing. You might still act the same, say the same things, but the empath is no longer responding to that surface level. They've already moved past it and decided it's not something they can rely on. And once that decision is made, their actions reflect it. They become quieter, less expressive, less present in ways that are consistent but not dramatic. There also comes a point where they stop trying to figure it out. In the beginning, they may analyze it, question it, even doubt their own perception.
But as the pattern continues, that curiosity fades. It turns into acceptance. Not that they're okay with it, but that this is what you're choosing to show. And once they accept that, they stop expecting anything different. At that stage, the connection loses its depth. It no longer feels meaningful or genuine. And for someone who values emotional truth so deeply, that kind of connection can't last.
So without conflict, without explanation, and without any dramatic exit, they slowly remove themselves from it. Another thing that quietly wears them down is giving without receiving. At the beginning, they give freely. Their attention, their understanding, their energy, it comes naturally. They listen deeply, they show up fully, and they create space for emotions most people ignore. And in those early stages, they're not keeping score. They're focused on connection, not balance. But over time, something shifts. The conversations start revolving around you, your struggles, your needs, your emotions, while their inner world slowly gets pushed aside. They become the one you lean on, the one who carries the emotional weight without hesitation. At first, they accept this role because helping others matters to them. They believe that if they keep showing up, things will balance out naturally. But eventually, they notice that balance never comes.
When they need support, it's not met with the same depth. When they open up, the response feels shallow, distracted, or quickly redirected back to you.
And that's when it starts to change. Not suddenly, but quietly. Sometimes it's not even obvious or intentional. It shows up in small ways, a missed follow-up, changing the topic too quickly, or giving a response that doesn't really acknowledge what they just shared. But for an empath, those little moments matter. They carry weight. Over time, they start to reflect a lack of emotional give and take that becomes harder to ignore. As this pattern continues, the drain begins. Not all at once, but slowly. It's the exhaustion of always being the one who listens, supports, and holds space without receiving the same in return. It's that quiet realization that the connection is becoming one-sided, even if the other person doesn't recognize it. And because empaths are naturally patient, they don't pull away right away. They give more chances. They try to adjust. Sometimes they even tell themselves that maybe the other person just isn't aware of what's happening.
But during this time, something shifts inside them. They start noticing how much they're giving compared to what they're getting back. They pay attention to how they feel after interactions, drained instead of uplifted, heavy instead of balanced. This awareness doesn't always lead to confrontation. More often it leads to quiet change.
They begin to pull back little by little. They protect their energy in subtle ways, responding a bit slower, engaging a bit less, creating space without making it obvious. And if the imbalance continues, the connection starts to weaken. Not because they suddenly stop caring, but because they can't keep investing in something that doesn't give back. They slowly step out of the role they've been playing. The one who's always there, always listening, always holding everything together. It no longer feels right to them. And once they step out of that role, everything changes. From the outside, it can feel confusing. The person who was once so present now seems distant. Conversations that used to flow easily now feel shorter, less alive. But what's really happening is a shift toward balance. They're no longer stretching themselves to maintain something that lacks mutual effort.
They're choosing to give that energy back to themselves or to people who meet them with the same depth. At some point, they also stop expecting things to change. In the beginning, there's hope that things will even out, that awareness will grow, that the connection will become more mutual. But when the same pattern keeps repeating, that hope fades. It gets replaced with clarity, the understanding that this dynamic isn't sustainable for them long term.
And once they reach that clarity, their actions become more intentional. They don't pull back randomly, they do it with purpose. They limit how much they give, how much they engage, and how much access they allow. In doing so, they create emotional distance that grows quietly over time until the connection no longer feels the same. Another thing empaths pick up on quickly is manipulation, even when it's subtle. Not because they're looking for it, but because they naturally sense intention. They don't just hear your words, they feel the energy behind them. They notice how something is said, what reaction it's trying to create, and why. So when someone uses guilt, pressure, or subtle emotional tactics to influence them, it doesn't work the way it's expected to. Instead of getting pulled in, they become more aware. At first, it might be so subtle that they don't immediately react.
They just feel that something isn't quite right. There's a mismatch between what's being said and what's actually intended. They don't jump to conclusions right away. Empaths tend to consider context.
They think about whether the behavior might come from insecurity, fear, or lack of awareness. That's why they don't always confront it immediately. Instead, they observe. They watch to see if it repeats, if it becomes a pattern. And once that pattern becomes clear, their response changes. What started as patience turns into quiet understanding. They begin to see the strategy behind certain words, the emotional pull behind certain actions. Whether it's guilt-tripping, playing the victim, or creating pressure to get a specific response, it all becomes easier to recognize over time. When that awareness clicks, they stop reacting the same way. They don't get caught up in the emotional pull anymore. Instead, they become calmer, more grounded, harder to influence. Their responses get shorter, less reactive, less emotionally involved. Not because they don't care, but because they've chosen not to engage in something that feels forced or controlling.
This shift can confuse the other person. The same tactics that once worked suddenly stop having an effect. The empath doesn't rush to fix things or reassure anymore. They don't respond with urgency or emotional intensity. And because this change happens quietly, it can feel like a sudden disconnect. But in reality, it's a conscious withdrawal from a dynamic they no longer want to be part of.
As it continues, their boundaries become stronger. They stop questioning themselves or wondering if they're overreacting. The pattern is clear now. They don't need more proof. And with that clarity, they begin to limit access. They share less about themselves. They become more selective in what they respond to. They stop engaging with things that feel manipulative. At some point, they also stop trying to understand why it's happening. In the beginning, they may try to figure it out, to see the deeper reason behind the behavior. But over time, that need fades. Their focus shifts from understanding others to protecting themselves. From the outside, it may look like they've become distant or uninterested. But internally, it's a clear decision. They're stepping away from something that feels inauthentic and controlling. And once they reach that point, it's not easy to reverse.
Because for an empath, trust isn't just about words, it's about intention. And when that intention feels off, the connection slowly loses its foundation. The final cutoff doesn't happen suddenly or out of anger. It's the result of a long process that most people never see. By the time an empath reaches that point, they've already gone through stages of understanding, patience, and quiet adjustment. They've noticed the patterns, felt the imbalance, and accepted the reality of what the connection has become. In the beginning, cutting someone off completely doesn't even feel like an option to them. They naturally try to maintain connection, to understand, to give space for things to improve.
Even when something feels off, they try to adjust internally. They lower expectations, reduce emotional investment, and try to make the connection manageable. That's why they often stay longer than most, not because they don't see what's happening, but because they're willing to give more chances than they should. But as the pattern continues, their perspective changes. It stops being about isolated moments and starts becoming a clear, repeated reality that doesn't meet their emotional needs. And once that clarity sets in, everything shifts. They stop asking if things will get better and start accepting that this is how it is. That shift from hoping to accepting is quiet but powerful. During this phase, their detachment deepens. They're no longer reacting emotionally to every inconsistency. Instead, they become more neutral, more observant, more focused inward. The connection begins to lose its depth. What once felt intense and meaningful now feels distant.
They may still show up, still respond, still be present on the surface, but the emotional depth is no longer there. It's been slowly withdrawn over time. And this detachment isn't cold or careless, it's controlled, it's intentional.
They create space within themselves before they ever create it outwardly. Because when they finally decide to walk away, they don't want it to come from emotion. They want it to come from clarity, from a place where they fully understand what they experienced and what it means for their future. An empath doesn't leave suddenly. They detach quietly long before anyone notices. What looks like normal patience is actually deep observation of patterns, emotional shifts, and consistency in behavior. They pick up on small things others ignore, like changes in tone, lack of follow-up, or energy that doesn't match words. At first, they give space and try to understand, hoping things will balance out. But over time, repeated emotional inconsistency or lack of reciprocity starts to drain them. They slowly begin to pull back, not out of anger, but self-protection.
Their energy becomes more reserved, their response is shorter, and their presence less available. They stop overgiving and stop explaining themselves because they've already seen enough to understand the pattern. Manipulation or inauthentic behavior only speeds up this process as they can sense emotional intent easily. Once clarity replaces confusion, they no longer seek answers, they choose distance. The final withdrawal isn't emotional chaos, it's calm decision-making. By the time they leave, they've already left emotionally long ago. It was never about sudden anger or emotional collapse, but about quiet awareness building over time until clarity became stronger than attachment. What once felt like patience was actually them slowly stepping back while still being present.
And when they finally left, it wasn't a reaction. It was a decision made long before you noticed. The silence they leave behind isn't emptiness. It's the final proof that they already chose themselves.